PPP round, I don't know, it could be round 10 for all I know. It all starting all to run together. But where we are right now, and the reason for the call is to provide sort of broad level and a high level of information with regards to the forgiveness process for the PPP loans that I'm sure all of you have, otherwise you wouldn't be on this call. So what I'd like to do is, with the help of my partner, good friend Lane Rhodes, who heads up our SBA efforts here in Nashville and really across the state, I'd like just to go through the process at a very high level and not specific to Pinnacle, but at a very high level, go through the process with you, point out some guidelines that you really need to be mindful of as you start the forgiveness process, and then open it up to Q&A, and we can go through logistics on how we're going to do that when we get to that part. But as Samir said, we during the application process back in April, we did put a lot of PPP loans and PPP money out on the street. Specifically, we helped almost 14,000 small business owners. I think that equates to roughly, what was it, $2 billion in loans, Lane? Something
about 2.6, 2.8, somewhere around there.
2.8. Damn near killed us in the process. Longest 3 to 4 weeks of my entire life, professional life, that is. But we got it done. So the good news with regards to forgiveness is it should be a lot easier for both the borrower and the banks, as we've had plenty of time to try to get our forgiveness portals and applications up and running. Pinnacle has it's available now, so it'll be a lot more streamlined, a lot easier for you to apply for forgiveness, and you have plenty of time to do so. And we can talk about this in a second, but quite frankly, unless you're planning on selling the company or buying another company who has a BP loan, I think there's very little incentive to apply for forgiveness right out of the gate. We can talk about that in a little more detail. Bad news is that, like the application process, there are many guidelines that have yet to be answered, a lot of questions that borrowers and banks have. And so, like the application process, the SBA in some ways is flying the plane while they're still trying to build it. And so because of that, that's one of the incentives you have for just waiting a little longer before you apply for forgiveness. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Lane with the task of trying to provide some clarity with regards to the forgiveness process. She'll do that for a few minutes. I'll ask 1 or 2 questions, and then we can jump into the Q&A and conversation, which, as Samira said, I want this call to be a conversation to the best extent possible via remote and Zoom. So we'll try to make that happen. So Lane, I'll let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. It is great to be with you all this morning and to see those faces. I have been speaking and moderating a conference this week, actually, for SBA lenders across the country, and we've been talking all week directly with about 150 people at SBA that have been key in kind of putting the SBA process together, putting the forgiveness process together. Got to talk to the software developers that actually put the software in place that's going to be running the forgiveness process for SBA. So that was really great this week to kind of hear from them. They were the people actually building this plane, as banks and business owners have been trying to fly it and take advantage of the program that was put together. And for the most part, I think the program has worked really well, and it's gotten money in the right hands of business owners so that they can keep employees paid, which was the main point of the program. I think it is important, Kevin, just when we start talking about forgiveness, there were several changes that happened in June to the PPP loan program itself, and that was through the Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act. And that act gave us some really great changes that allowed for business owners to have more flexibility in how they use those funds. And the first one was extending the initial 8-week time period that you had to use your funds to giving business owners 24 weeks. So that was a really great change. Another change that came about from the Flexibility Act was allowing business owners to only have to use 60% of the funds on payroll cost versus the original 75. So that left 40% of the funds now that could be used on other expenses. And so that was another really nice change to the program. They also gave us some additional guidance on what happens and if an employee, has to quit. Does that count in my head count? What if I have to fire somebody for due cause? Is that going to still count against me? And am I not going to be eligible for forgiveness because somebody's been stealing from me during COVID and I have to let them go? So they gave us some really good rules to where we can exclude those types of things in the head count. So if you as a business owner had to let somebody go with due cause, or you have an employee that for one reason or another has decided not to come back to work during COVID, now because of these changes to the act, those head counts would not be counted in your overall deductions for forgiveness. So you can go ahead and just remove them from the equation. So those changes, I think, really allowed for the program to kind of morph and change and allow for you guys to use the money more wisely as a business owner. Now, I wish they had kind of made some of those changes earlier on, because by June when this was passed, a lot of people were already through their initial 8 weeks and might have already used all the funds. However, it did really help some of our business owners who had not used those funds. And now you have a longer runway to be able to actually get people back in the office now that things are starting to open up again, and use those funds truly on those employees that you were wanting to bring back to the job there. So now that kind of brings us where we are today. The forgiveness process did go live on August 10th, and Pinnacle Bank is happy to say that our forgiveness process is up and running. There are a lot of banks out there that are still putting that process into place. So it's not to say that every bank out there is accepting applications right now for forgiveness, but I think to Kevin's point earlier, it is good to know that there is really no mad rush to get your application in for forgiveness. The money's there, it's not going away. So as the application process was a mad rush to get in because you were so scared that those funds would disappear if you didn't get your application in first, it's not like that with forgiveness. So we are really encouraging people to kind of wait to see what Congress does. There has been talks from Congress on potentially passing a law that would allow for blanket forgiveness for businesses that took out $150,000 or less, and then kind of staggering the forgiveness requirements depending on the loan amount. So for instance, maybe you got a loan of $350,000, so you don't get the blanket forgiveness that might be given for $150,000 or under, but your requirements for $350,000 and under may be less than if you got $1 million PPP loan. So those are the things being kicked around in Congress right now. We don't see anything passing in the next week or so. They've got other business that they're working on, because this change would be part of the phase 4 plan that's out there for stimulus. But we are paying close attention to it, and so if there are any changes there, we'll definitely bring that up to you guys and let you know. But the forgiveness process as it sits right now, there are 2 applications. So there is a form 3805, which is the long form, the full form for applying for forgiveness. But most people will be able to use the simpler form that SBA put out, and that is the 3805 EZ form. And so if you can attest to these 3 things, so either one, if you were a sole proprietor or a 1099 contractor, you had no employees, it was just you applying for your PPP loan, then you can use the EZ form. Or if you are a business owner that has, employees on the payroll, and you can attest that you did not reduce salaries and wages by more than 25% throughout the period, then you can also use the EC form. And then the third one is if you didn't have a reduction if you had a reduction in business because of COVID and that impacted you and you didn't have to cut headcounts by 25% or more, then you can also use the EZ form. So Bottom line is, if you didn't have a 25% reduction in payroll or headcount, more than likely you can use this EZ form, which is a much simpler form to use. It's only 3 pages long, and if you can attest to one of those 3 things, then you're eligible to use that form. So really, it's only going to be people that had a true headcount reduction of more than 25%, or their overall payroll numbers, salary-wise, dropped by more than 25%. So those would fall into using the longer form. Now the EZ form, just from a logistical standpoint of filling it out, it is a paper form, but most lenders are going to be using some sort of electronic process where you would fill this all in on your computer electronically. So we're not saying you need to go print out a bunch of paper and start filling out a paper application, but if you wanted to go ahead and print it, it is available out there on the Treasury website. It's available on Pinnacle's website. The SBA has a version out there as well. And so you can go look at it, print it out. But I would really advise people to contact their banks on how the bank is going to administer this forgiveness process, because SBA has given us flexibility as a lender that as long as we have the questions answered that's in that application, we can use our own electronic form online. And being able to push this out, just as an example with Pinnacle, we did over 14,000 loans. So that's 14,000 clients coming back to us to apply for forgiveness. If we can help streamline that process some, it's only going to help those applications get through the system faster. So most banks are going to be using an electronic platform to be able to do that. And it is a twofold system. So the bank is going to look at the forgiveness application. They're going to look at all your supporting documentation. They're going to let you know whether they think you're going to get full forgiveness, partial forgiveness, or no forgiveness. And then they send that on to the SBA to be processed. SBA is going to do a brief review, or in the case of maybe it being, 150 or less blanket forgiveness, then they would just forgive those. But more than likely, everybody's going to have to complete some sort of application with the bank to get their forgiveness application in and over to SBA. The banks have 60 days to process them and get them sent to SBA, and then SBA has 90 days to process them to give the banks back the money to when your loan would actually be paid off or partially paid off, so that you got your forgiveness amount. Now, in my conversations with SBA this week, and I was talking with Marty Andrews, who actually heads up this PPP process for SBA, he made it very clear to us that SBA intends to use their 90-day window. So they're not saying things maybe won't get pushed through faster, but he was really advising us that if they have to start really digging in and looking at the applications, they want to make sure they get this right. So it really could take up to 90 days for SBA to forgive your application. So that is something good to remember. Another thing that SBA advised us about, because they're getting a lot of questions on it, is if you got an EIDL advance. So not an EIDL loan, but an EIDL advance, that will automatically come off your forgiveness amount. So just to use round numbers here, let's say you got a $50,000 PPP loan and you got a $5,000 EIDL advance. The bank is going to approve your loan and look at it, and everything lines up. You get full forgiveness. We're going to submit it over to SBA, but SBA is only going to send us a check back for $45, even though you got full forgiveness, because they're saying that EIDL advance was an advance of your PPP forgiveness amount up front. So it doesn't mean you didn't get full forgiveness. It just means that the SBA gave you part of your forgiveness up front through the mechanism of an EIDL advance. And so I think that's important to remember. Kevin, I don't know what other questions you might have on the process itself, but would be happy to kind of open it up out there for some question and answer time period for those of you in EO that maybe have specific questions on your forgiveness application.
Let me, I'll start off with one or two questions. Just use my prerogative as the moderator here. But one, I get a lot of questions from clients who, let's say scenario is something like this. They've used or they've selected the 24-week coverage period. Money runs out at week 16 or 17. There's usually two questions. One, can they go ahead and apply for forgiveness after the money is depleted? And number two, what happens if they do have to make a layoff or cut outside of the safe harbor rules of firing for cause and other things? But let's say they have to let some people go between the time they run out of money and apply for forgiveness in that 24-week period. Will that count against them if they have to make those changes?
That is a great question. SBA did put out a couple of FAQs recently on the forgiveness process where they tried to address this particular question. So they did tell us that as a lender, if somebody opts to use that 24-week time period, they do not have to wait till the end of the 24 weeks to apply for forgiveness if they've used the money up in, say, 16 weeks, like you said. So you're welcome to come and apply for forgiveness at any point during that 24 weeks once you use up all the funds. However, the application, the way it reads today, and the SBA has not said at this point that they are going to modify the forgiveness application, but you're attesting on that application that your head count remains at what you put on there at the time of forgiveness through the end of that 24 weeks. So that's how, from a legal standpoint, that's how that attestation reads on the form for forgiveness. So it is kind of a tricky area there. I've talked to several attorneys about this because, you know, we don't want people out there attesting to something that they may not be able to, you know, back up in the future if SBA were to come back, you know, once they got their full forgiveness and asked to review their files to see if they truly kept their employees at that certain level of headcount. So it's a very tricky gray area there. You know, the best advice the attorneys can give is that, you know, you are attesting that you're going to keep your head count at what it was at the time you asked for forgiveness through the end of that 24 weeks. That's not to say, Kevin, that SBA won't come back and change that, but as it sits right now, that's what it looks like. But that's not to say that once you submit the documents to SBA, they're not going to grant you full forgiveness. But I think it's a good thing to remember out there for everyone that SBA has told us as the bank and told you guys as the borrowers on these loans that you must keep all your PPP documentation for 6 years. And at any point during that 6 years, SBA can make the decision to come back and review your loan and review your forgiveness. I don't see SBA spending a ton of time doing that. They just don't have the manpower. You know, they're not an investigative group. They approve loans. They're there to, you know, they're more of a marketing and PR group for the government is really what SBA is. So I don't see them spending a lot of time trying to dig into people that maybe, you know, had a reduction in headcount between that window of when they applied for forgiveness and when they attested that they were going to keep that headcount the same, but you just never know. So you've got to hold on to those documents, and SBA does have the right within 6 years to come back and look at those. And I've also heard from attorneys, Kevin, that are really telling me you should keep your documents for 10 years because the statute of limitation for fraud cases like this with the financial industry is 10 years, not 6. So even though the SBA's thrown out 6 years, if they really wanted to go after somebody for potential fraud on the PPP program, they have up to 10 years to do that.
Lovely. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's get to some questions. There's a few on the chat. So if you would just submit them through the chat, I will try to manage this process as much as possible. Brittany, great question. What if full-time employees and salary wasn't reduced, but the hourly employees were reduced by demand? So hourly people who deliver the services were also reduced by demand. Brittany, unmute if you would mind. I just want to make sure I understand the question, which you're saying headcount.
If a company, they are paid by the hour, client demand of hours. So say a client needs 500 hours on normal time and their employees are the ones that are actually providing those services. But let's say the services went down during that time to 350 hours. So therefore the hourly people only received 350 hours. So their pay wasn't reduced, but just by nature of the demand for the business services reduced, the demand for the hourly employee services were also reduced. Would that qualify as being considered a wage reduction?
If it was less than what 25% would have been this time last year during whatever look back period they picked for their application, that would count as a wage reduction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brittany. Jeff, what are the tax implications for loan forgiveness? I actually got this question the other day, and I seem to recall when the program came out, there was a lot of chatter about it's not taxable, but there is a loophole where there is a tax consequence of some type. So, can you walk through that with regards to forgiveness?
So from a forgiveness standpoint, SBA has not addressed tax implications. And the reason for that is Congress, with the intent, did say that they didn't want PPP money to be taxed as, income that the business earned. However, when you're doing a program that's going out there to every different business type that there is, it's not that easy within our IRS tax code. So you have businesses that are sole proprietors, you have 1099 contracts, you have general partnerships. All of those businesses are taxed in different ways depending on how they recognize income and how they recognize expenses. So it's not as easy for Congress to say that their intent was for the funds to not be taxed. You would literally have to go in and make changes to the IRS tax code for each one of those business entities to truly make the money not have a tax, negative tax implication from getting PPP funds. So there's not a blanket answer for that, unfortunately. The best answer is depending on how your company is organized, how you do your write-offs and your expenses, whether you're a sole prop, whether you're a general partnership, whether you're an S Corp or a C Corp, you're going to need to talk to your CPA about how those PPP funds are going to impact you specifically.
Good. Thanks, Lane.
Sure.
What state local employment taxes are forgivable? There's two parts to this question. What are the state local employment taxes which are forgivable for under PPP? Second question is dental and vision insurance premiums included under PPP forgiveness? And that may be, yeah, go ahead.
So yes, state and local taxes are not included in the forgiveness calculation. So those are not part of what goes into the payroll calculation when you're calculating your forgiveness. You're going to input your gross payroll amount. That is the true cash compensation that you give to your employees or you give to yourself as the owner. But state and local taxes are not included as part of that. And then for benefits, yes, you can include health and insurance benefits that the company pays for. So, just take for instance here at Pinnacle, I'm on a health insurance plan here at Pinnacle. I contribute a portion from my paycheck into that, and Pinnacle contributes a portion that makes up 100% of the cost of what that healthcare benefit is. So whether it's dental, vision, all of that falls under healthcare and can be included in your forgiveness, but it's only the portion the employer pays. It's not the portion that the employee pays.
Great. What other questions? Either, as Samira says, don't be shy. I've got a question. So, will there be more PPP money? I know there's legislation that is out there that has been stalled in Congress. Within that, I think there's talks and discussion about more PPP funds. There's also the talk about a blanket forgiveness for all loans of $150,000 or less, which I know is very popular, and I'd be shocked if that doesn't happen, which sort of gets to the point of maybe waiting a little longer. So, but back to the first point, I've gotten several questions about, there'll be a new round of PPP funds. Or what's your comment or what's your thoughts?
Yeah, so in talking with SBA this week, they were pretty optimistic about Congress coming back. It would have to be obviously approved through Congress. It's not something that SBA unilaterally can decide. There's two options on the table for that. So the PPP loan program itself is a temporary program that expired. at the end of July. So, or actually, I guess it went through August 8th is when it ended up expiring after they extended it. They did not choose to extend it again once it did expire. And so they have the option to make PPP a permanent SBA loan program. So meaning if we got into one of these instances again, it would be similar to their economic injury disaster loan program, that this program could be brought up in the time of, you know, an economic disaster or economic uncertainty, to be able to offer the PPP loans to the community at that time. And Congress would have to vote to, you know, get the program back up and running, but it would be a permanent program now within SBA. So that is pending out there, along with potentially refunding it for another round. So a PPP round 3 per se. There have been talks about that, Kevin, and SBA does seem to be optimistic that that may happen. There's a lot of pushback from the banking lobbying organizations that before a round 3 comes out, they need to really fine tune the guidelines, because the guidelines change throughout the entire process. They continue to change throughout the forgiveness process. And so the banks are really hesitant about a round 3 coming out unless the SBA truly spends time fine tuning what those guidelines are going to be, so that we don't get into these instances where a business owner takes out a loan under one assumption, and by the time they apply for forgiveness, the program's totally changed to where that business owner may have decided not to have taken the loan if they had known all of the changes that were going to occur. Yeah. So I think that, you know, there probably will be some sort of PPP round 3 that comes out. I think it's going to take Congress and SBA and Treasury really fine tuning this before any bank's going to get on board and do a round 3. So I don't see something happening in, you know, the next few weeks. I think this would maybe be if, you know, the COVID crisis we're in continues on for another, you know, 3 to 6 months. Yes, there's going to be more PPP money that's going to be needed, but we really need to have very specific guidelines so that the program doesn't change and end up actually hurting business owners actually after they take the money versus helping them.
Right. Great. Are there exemptions for headcount based on demand of services like the restaurant industry? So I know, you know, restaurants and others have been forced to close by government mandate. So is there any type of exemption or relief?
No, there's no exemptions at this point. Everything with PPP is broad based for every, you know, type of company that took it out, whether it was a nonprofit, you know, from a church all the way to, you know, a bar and grill in downtown Nashville. So the guidelines for forgiveness are the same regardless of what type of business that you own. But to that point, Kevin, some of the talks for round 3 funding would be more specifically targeted at businesses that have been impacted more substantially by COVID, such as the restaurant industry. So I think if there is a round 3 of funding, that those types of businesses, you know, hospitality, restaurant, those are really going to be the ones that get to have the benefit of a 3rd round. It's not going to be blanket that any business that can attest that they've been impacted by COVID, they're going to really have to show how they've been impacted and probably see a reduction in their revenue numbers by more than 50%.
Gotcha. Emily asked a question which I was actually just thinking about, and to clarify a point you made earlier, which is the deadline for forgiveness. So her question is, it looks like forgiveness application was August 8th. Does that stand, or have they pushed that date back? It's my understanding that borrowers have 10 months after the end of their coverage period through October 31st of 2021 to apply for forgiveness. Is that correct?
That is correct, Kevin. Yeah, that August 8th date.
You said something about year end, and I don't know if you're talking about year end of this year or next year, but it's sort of, they've got 10 months after the end of the coverage period to make that application for forgiveness, correct?
Yeah, there's a couple of dates in there. So the August 8th date was when the application process ended to get a PPP loan. So that date had nothing to do with forgiveness. And then you're correct, Kevin. Now, if you opted to use the 24-week period, you have through December 31st, but you can't use the funds after December 31st. So any funds that you use after December 31st would not be forgiven if you still had funds on your PPP loan. So that's the end date of when you could actually use your PPP money. But then you're right, Kevin, if you waited all the way to December 31st, you don't have to come back to the bank and apply for forgiveness until 10 months after that date. So it's a really long runway. That's why we're telling people there's just not a big rush right now to really get your forgiveness applications in, with the exception of if you're having a change in ownership in your business. So if you're selling your company, you're buying out a partner, anything like that. The SBA, as it stands right now, they are saying they're going to put out some guidelines in the next few weeks on changes of ownership. But as it sits right now, the SBA has told us specifically that you must get and apply for forgiveness. Otherwise, you're potentially putting your forgiveness at jeopardy if you have a change in ownership prior to getting forgiveness on your PPP loan.
Gotcha. Can accrued 401k amounts be counted? Pretty sure the answer is no, but how do retirement plans and specifically accrued 401k amounts, fit into the whole forgiveness?
So on 401k, any sort of retirement payments that you're doing, they have to be within that covered period. So something that was accrued prior to or is going to be accrued later in the year cannot be paid out. It's only what's during that covered time period. So the most recent FAQ that the SBA put out has really good guidance around this. So I would highly suggest if somebody has questions specifically on retirement payments, to go to the SBA or Treasury website to look at that most recent FAQ, because they did give guidelines that said the retirement payments are truly only retirement contributions that were accrued and paid during the covered time period of your loan.
Okay. Another question, doesn't have to be the last question. We're talking about the blanket forgiveness, 150,000. Do you think that amount will be increased to 200,000?
I honestly don't know. I mean, Congress has not mentioned blanket forgiveness in a few weeks now. So, I mean, this came about probably about 3 weeks ago. It was, both House and Senate had their own different versions of a bill for blanket forgiveness out there. And over the last few weeks, as election stuff has started to bubble up, we had all the stuff with the post office, everything with PPP kind of got pushed to the wayside. So there's not a lot of chatter, honestly, right now with any sort of blanket forgiveness. I did see a question, Kevin, that popped up about first quarter commissions being paid. Once again, commissions can be included in that cash payment, but it's got to be cash payments that were accrued or incurred during your covered time period. So anything from first quarter and would not necessarily be included in the forgiveness numbers because it wasn't accrued and earned during that covered time period. You can choose to use an alternative payroll time period that would include commissions from that time period, but it doesn't go all the way back to first quarter if you use the alternative payroll covered period. And then when we're talking about non-payroll related expenses, so interest expense, utilities, those sorts of things, those are all have to be done during your covered time period. So you absolutely cannot pay a utility bill that was incurred in first quarter. It has to be from when you got your PPP money until the end date of when you're done using your PPP money. Those are going to be the only things in the non-payroll related expenses. I think another thing to point out that the FAQs kind of helped clarify for us is we were originally using kind of a broad scope for interest payments on business loans, and they came back and clarified that we can only include in the forgiveness calculation interest payments on real property, real personal property, or real estate. So it's got to be a mortgage loan or an equipment loan or an inventory loan, something like that that's for a hard fixed asset. Lines of credit, interest payments on lines of credit and unsecured debt such as credit card payments and stuff like that, those are not included in the forgiveness numbers. So that's something to remember when you're putting together your forgiveness information. It's also important to remember on those non-payroll expenses that they had to be in place as of February 15th of this year. So if you've got a rent payment that's due out there, we're going to need a copy of the lease to prove to us that the lease was in place as of February 15th of this year. And then we would also like to mention that if your lease renewed maybe in June, which definitely could have happened out there, we're going to need to see a copy of your renewal and a copy of the original lease. It's okay if it renewed and you're under a new lease now starting in June or July of this year and you still want to include those payments for forgiveness. But there is a lot of documentation that goes into documenting those non-payroll expenses. So just remember to make sure you've got all of that paperwork gathered. It's important to kind of get all of that stuff gathered before you start filling out your PPP application. And if you use a third-party payroll provider, they're really going to be able to give you some great documents from your payroll records to be able to complete, whether it's the easy form or the long form. You'll be able to complete that really easily if you have a third-party payroll provider that can provide you your payroll documents.
What other questions? Questions, comments? Feel free to put in the chat or even unmute your Bueller. All right. Let's I guess let's just sign off. Well, let's bring this to a close for the spirit of being a Friday morning. And I know that people have other things to do other than talk about the very exciting topic of PPP forgiveness. If you're a Pinnacle client, we have very good resources that I'm more than happy to provide that provide all the information we have to date on the forgiveness process. If you're not a Pinnacle client, shame on you. I'm just kidding. But if you went through another bank to get your PPP forgiveness, they will be guiding you through the process, and more than likely they've, like Pinnacle, been working very hard to automate and make the process a lot easier than the application process. Lane, any other final thoughts or anything they should be thinking of right now as they prepare for forgiveness, in addition to pulling the documents together? Any sort of must-dos before they start the process?
Yeah, I think it just is important to make sure you have all of those documents ready. That's really going to help the process go fast for you. So gathering your payroll documents, the 941s, getting all of that information, buttoned down so you can, that's really the bulk of the application, honestly, is you have to input every single employee. Gathering your health insurance records, if you pay health insurance or retirement benefits, having all of that stuff ready to easily put into those forgiveness applications or into some sort of calculator. I know from a Pinnacle standpoint and from like ADP has their own calculator that helps you kind of prepare. You can put all this information in and it'll tell you, what your proposed forgiveness amount will be. So Pinnacle Bank has one of those. If you use a third-party payroll provider, they also have calculators they've put together, and they're all great, and they all really are giving you some good feedback there as to what will be forgiven. If you used 100% of the funds on payroll, then I would not bother bringing in some of those non-payroll related expenses, because that's just more documentation you have to document. But if you didn't use all of it on payroll and you still have some money left, I would encourage you guys to hold on to it. You can continue using this throughout the 24 weeks on those non-payroll related expenses. So if you've got rent that's, occurring, if you've got, utilities that you can pay with it and you still have money left, definitely use up that money before you come and apply for forgiveness. Have your EIDL information handy if you've got an EIDL advance, so that you know how much is going to be deducted when SBA sends you over your forgiveness money for the EIDL. And then on all of those non-payroll related expenses, you're going to have to document those really well for the bank. So the payroll is pretty simple. Most everybody has payroll documents that they can can easily go get through the payroll that they run, whether weekly, bi-weekly, monthly. But those other non-payroll related expenses are going to take a little bit more time to gather the paperwork for. So you're going to need to get monthly statements. You're going to need to get a statement that shows it was in place as of February 15th. And then on the mortgage interest or the interest expense side of the house, if your monthly statement doesn't break out the portion that is principal and interest, you're going to need an amortization table, because remember, we're only paying or only granting forgiveness on the interest portion of that expense. So you need to have it clearly broken out what is interest and what is principal payment. So just being prepared, Kevin, and I highly encourage people to go work with their banker to help them get all these documents in a row. We want to make sure we get it right, because SBA is really giving us one pass at this when we send it to them for forgiveness. If they deny it for any reason, the bank is not able to go back and appeal it. So the appeal process is only between you as the borrower and SBA. So at that point, the bank's out of the picture. The borrower would appeal it directly with SBA, and SBA has months on appeal processes to be able to review these. So I highly encourage people to make sure that those numbers are right before you get into the bank, or to sit down with your banker to 100% make sure they're right before it goes over to SBA, because I would not want to get stuck in that appeal process with SBA. It sounds like that's probably going to be very cumbersome and could take a long time. And then for those of you that have a PPP loan of $2 million or more, the SBA has not even put out guidance on that process yet for forgiveness. So it's not to say you can't go and submit an application through the forgiveness process right now, but SBA is holding on to those to gather those until they get a formalized process in place on exactly how they're going to handle those loans of $2 million or more. So definitely, if you have a $2 million or more loan, there's really no big rush right now, because SBA is still finalizing exactly what they're going to do with those and how they're going to do those audits on those larger PPP loans. But that's really it. Just be prepared and work with your banker to make sure you have all the documents in place prior to applying for forgiveness.
Good.